Chapter 5. A neighbor lady had kindly set 8 turkey eggs for me, which were now hatched out. The next morning, with my little turkeys tucked under my arm, I walked down to the livery stable, got my horse and wagon, and started home. One of our sudden spring storms blew up, and although it was the 8th of May, it was one of the coldest trips I had ever made across the desert. My little turkeys were protected under the wagon canvas, but I was sitting out in the rain and the snow, wearing only a light spring coat. It rained, it snowed, it sleeted, while the wind blew a perfect gale. I finally had to get out and walk on the sheltered side of old Johnny to keep warm. I would walk till I was tired, then climb back into the wagon and sit till I'd nearly freeze. I think I walked half of that 35 miles, but I was so happy over my good news that I didn't mind the discomfort. When I got home, I burst into the house and hollered, "We got our school! We got our school!" Daddy was as jubilant over it as I. I let old Johnny rest for a few days, then hitched him to the wagon, and with the 3 little girls, drove the 20 miles over to Miss Bennett's to get acquainted and tell her about our good news. I thought perhaps I could get some information about running a school. I found her to be a woman in her early 60s. Her 2 remaining school-age children were a girl of 16 and a boy of 17, both in the 8th grade. They were brilliant children, but had purposefully held back in their work so as to hold on to the school. Holding the school was more of a financial asset than an educational one. The teacher's board was a financial aid too, as Miss Bennett charged $40 a month. In meeting Miss Bennett, I was both surprised and concerned about her appearance. Her hair, which had been brick red, was mixed with gray, making it a real taffy color. Her beautiful blue eyes looked out of deep-set sockets in the most bony, wrinkled face I had ever seen. She gave one the feeling that she had been recently rescued from a famine district. The wrinkled face made such an impression on my 4-year-old Leslie that she climbed up on my lap and whispered, "Mama, what makes that lady's face so curly?" Miss Bennett had been a widow for years, but her 80-year-old mother-in-law still lived with her. During the day, she and the old lady got into an argument over something that had happened years before. The discussion became quite heated until the younger woman became a little ashamed of herself. Backing off into the kitchen just before she slammed the door, she said, "Mother, we won't argue about it any more, but I know I'm right." Bang went the kitchen door. The old lady tossed her head and, looking at me, said, "What in the hell does Liz know about it? She's a Johnny-come-lately in these parts. She's only been here 50 years. I have now lived in Washoe County, Nevada, 55 years, and like to think of myself as an old-timer. But by Grandma Bennett's standard, I was still a Johnny-come-lately. Arriving home that evening, I told Daddy of the wrinkles that the toil, care, and hardships of the desert had worn in Miss Bennett's face. If I thought it would happen to me, I told him, I'd leave the country at the first sign of a wrinkle. True to our school agreement, Miss Bennett held 5 months of school on her side of Tool Mountain, and we held 5 months on our side. Eventually, Miss Bennett sold out and moved away, and we fell heir to the whole school, which we held in our house for 14 years. It cost the state of Nevada $14,000 to put our 6 children through 8th grade, a record topped only by Miss Bennett herself. Now, with the school established, we had to decide what to do next. First things must come first. We were so enthusiastic over the school, we would have liked to pitch in and erect the school building right away. Common sense told us that it wouldn't come first. We had a whole year in which to hold this 5 months of school, so there was no immediate need for a building. Our vegetable garden was our first need. Everything was painfully slow, for we had no plow, harrow, or scraper, and only one old horse. We had to work by hand with spade, shovel, mattock, pick, and hand rake. Since AJ was a miner, his greatest knowledge and contribution to the place was in developing water. He went to work digging and developing to bring 3 small streams together, which made a good spring of water to irrigate with. Then, with pick, shovel, spade, and wheelbarrow, he laboriously dug a small reservoir. The springs and the reservoir were both on high ground, and underneath were acres of good virgin sagebrush land. While Daddy was employed developing water, the children and I cleared the sagebrush off a space of ground about 100 feet square. Then Edson and I, with mattock and spade, turned over the ground for our new garden. It was slow work, but what a happy time we all had working together out there in the sunshine. Even the baby was there, for the garden was a quarter of a mile from the cabin, and none of the children could be left behind. When our garden was all planted, we turned our attention to well digging. Until now, we'd been hauling water clear from the garden reservoir. We dug our well just a few feet in the back of the house and were able to strike water at a shallow depth. AJ hit water at 6 feet, and at 9 feet the flow was too strong to allow him to dig any more. We walled the well up with rocks within 2 feet of the surface of the ground. There we built a wide shelf all around the inside, and then finished walling the well to the surface. The shelf was a godsend. It was our only refrigerator for years. Cream, butter, leftovers from the table, everything that needed cooling went into that shelf, into the well on that shelf. Of course, we had to fence our garden with woven wire to keep out the jackrabbits, which necessitated a trip to town to buy wire. What we were going to use for money with which to buy the wire, I wondered. We had an early spring, and the sage hens had hatched early and were now big enough to eat. I suggested that instead of going to debt for the wire, Daddy should kill a couple dozen birds, and I should take them to Reno to sell them. At first he objected. "How do you know you can sell them?" "Well, there are 10,000 people living in Reno, and out of that number, I'll bet there are 24 willing to buy sage hens. It'll be my job to find that 24." It was the beginning of a new venture. What a wonderful thing it is to have confidence in one's self. I never for a moment doubted my ability to sell those birds. It was many years before I realized I had any sales ability. Later, I was to remark boastfully, "I've sold everything from our ranch, from a quart of gooseberries to a wagon load of manure." Daddy killed the sage hens, and I went to town with them. I had no trouble in selling them for $1 apiece. I had chosen for my customers doctors, lawyers, and businessmen. No going around to back doors for me in order to sell my produce. I always dealt with men, but I found them not only willing but eager to buy my grain, my game. Right there I had established a business. If we could supply the game, we could always eat. We would never have to worry again where our next bill of grub was going to come from. I sold my birds, bought some grub and the garden wire, and proudly returned home to fence the garden. In making our homestead plans, we had some friendly advice. One neighbor said, "Don't ever kill gopher snakes. You just can't raise a garden without 'em. They kill gophers and ground squirrels." We had learned to distinguish the difference between a gopher snake and a rattler. Although their markings were much the same, the rattler is much brighter in color and has more beautiful slender body with, of course, the string of rattles at the end of his tail. Legend has it that a rattler grows 1 rattle for each year. I don't know how true that is, but a snake is likely to lose some of his rattles crawling through our sharp Nevada rocks and sagebrush. We vowed not to kill any gopher snakes. One day a distant neighbor lady was helping me tack a quilt. We hadn't yet hung up the screens at the front and back kitchen doors. Our quilt was laid across our long homemade pine table, and we were busily working away. Then, when in crawled a whalin' big gopher snake, I screamed. There's simply something repulsive and uncanny looking about a snake. I didn't want to hurt it, so I got out the broom and very gently began to sweep it out, talking to it all the time. "Come on now, old fella, don't want to hurt you. Shoo on out." It was determined to stay in. I supposed it was the first contact it had ever had with human beings. It didn't know how mean we could be. Kept raising his head from the floor and trying to dodge around my broom, first one side, then the other. I was persistent in giving him gentle little sweeps and finally succeeded in sweeping him out and down the path. Coming back in, I went on with my quilt tacking. Our work was now in the center of the quilt, and we had to stand in a stooping position to tack it. We'd been working steadily about an hour when I straightened up, and without looking back to my chair and sat down on something soft and squirmy. I jumped clear across the floor and let out another blood-curdling scream. There in my chair was that immense big gopher snake coiled round and round on the cushion of the chair, his head hanging over the edge as nonchalantly as though he really belonged there. And there was Daddy on the front doorstep laughing with all his might. He said, "Remember, old lady, it's a gopher snake." I was standing there almost paralyzed with fear, cold chills running up and down my spine, uttering exclamations of, "Ugh! Ugh!" I was so angry with Daddy for laughing, for it's awful to be laughed at when you're as badly frightened as I was. I picked up the chair and gingerly carried it to the back door, giving it a good hard jerk and dumping the snake to the ground. Then I grabbed the broom and swatted him through the air, 10 feet at a swat. No gentle treatment this time. I got him outside the gate and down the gully, telling him he'd better stay there. When I came back into the house, Daddy was still chuckling. I looked at him belligerently and said, "If that thing comes back in here, I'm going to chop his head off. You just see if I don't." With that, I grabbed the darning needle and went furiously to work. All this time my friend sat there with a smile on her face, but I think she was afraid to laugh out loud. When we finished the quilt, it was noon and time to get dinner. When I reached into the wood box for fuel on the cook stove, the piece of wood I pulled out held that horrible big gopher snake. By now my patience was exhausted. I screamed again and slammed him outside the door. Then I picked up a garden hoe and cut his head off and carried him out to the sagebrush. When I came in, Daddy was still looking quite pleased. I shook my head at him and said, "A gopher snake may be a rancher's friend, but I'm not going to live in the same house with him." "Well, old lady, that one did get a little too sociable. Maybe the rest won't be that friendly." That and one other were the only gopher snakes we ever killed. We found they really, truly were the rancher's friend. After the garden was planted and fenced, disappointment came. My greatest disappointment I ever had. My dear AJ came down with one of his spells. I was so sure that fresh air and sunshine and rest would help him recover from his old malady. Maybe he'd worked too hard, although he had gone at it slowly and rested often. Now here he was on the flat of his back, fighting for every breath he drew. My whole world fell around me, but we had to keep on. The cowboys came often to offer their help. One day they came with what they thought was a good suggestion. I took them to AJ's bedside. The children, singing company, followed us in. They stood around Daddy's bed, goggle-eyed and with open ears and taking in every word. Pete, the old cowboy boss, broached the subject. "Mr. Olds, there's a couple unbranded yearling bulls up in the PF pasture. If you'll give us your branding iron, we'll put it on 'em for you." Then he explained, "It's unwritten law of the range that a leppy belongs to the first person to get his brand on it. A leppy is a long-eared unbranded calf that in some way has been separated from his mother. Usually they die of starvation or are killed by coyotes. Hence, they belong to whoever claims them with their brand. I have heard a famous rodeo announcer crack the same old joke every year. A leppy is a little calf whose ma died and whose pa's run away with another cow." Branding leppies is a legitimate business, but Daddy didn't think so. He looked at the cowboys and said, "No, boys, don't put my brand on one of those bulls. I know they're not mine. If my cow produces a calf, that's my calf. Otherwise, it's not mine." Then he went on, "I'll never be able to help the old lady and the children much, but I can at least help raise the kids to be honest. I'm not so good myself, and I don't mind being a thief, but I hate damn bad to raise one. No, boys, don't ever put my brand on a leppy." Dad might also have added that he was keeping his old lady honest too, for I thoroughly disagreed with him about branding leppies. I respected and believed the law of the range. I wanted to brand the leppies. I had charge of the branding iron. The cowboys would always help me. So why shouldn't I brand them? Because I couldn't live with an honest man who would think I was a thief. Though I was always good at spotting them, we never put our brand on one. Daddy was bedfast that spell for 3 weeks, and to make matters worse, the 3 older children were riding Johnny one day when he shied, and all 3 of them fell off. Little Alice hit her shoulder on a rock, causing an abscess to form, and in a few days she was terribly sick. My home remedies were of no avail. As if I didn't have enough troubles, Edson took down with a bilious spell. I didn't worry too much about him. He'd just eaten too much sow belly and beans, and I knew he'd be all right after a good vomiting spell. I was too worried over Daddy and Alice to be worried over him. Alice tossed and moaned and screamed and was running a high temperature. This was going on for 3 days and was continuing into the 3rd night. I was sitting at her bedside all the time. I couldn't stand it any longer. Something had to be done. I had to get her to a doctor, I told myself, or she would surely die. While I didn't expect Daddy to last from 1 hour to the next and could do nothing for him, I could help little Alice. So deciding what to do next was the hardest and most momentous decision I had ever made.